The morning sun cast long shadows across the Welsh countryside as Prince William stood at the window of his temporary office in Cardiff. He could see the rolling green hills that had become so familiar to him over the years, and for a moment, he allowed himself to remember the first time he had seen this landscape with Catherine by his side. Today was different, though. Today, he would address world leaders at an important summit, and he knew exactly what he wanted to say about the place that had shaped both his marriage and his understanding of what home truly meant. The Prince of Wales adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. In just a few hours, he would stand before delegates from dozens of countries, speaking not just as a member of the royal family, but as someone who had found his roots in this ancient land. The speech he was about to give would be personal in a way that few royal addresses ever were. He was going to talk about Wales not as a duty or an inheritance, but as the place where he and Catherine had built their first real home together. Staff members moved quietly around the building, making final preparations for the summit. William could hear the distant sound of security teams conducting their sweeps, the low hum of technical equipment being tested, and the soft conversations of protocol officers ensuring every detail was perfect. But his mind wasn't on the logistics of the event. Instead, he found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with Catherine just the night before. "You know," she had said as they walked through the gardens of their Welsh residence, "when people ask me where home is, I don't think about London or Buckingham Palace first anymore. I think about here. I think about the first place we were just William and Catherine before everything else." Those words had stayed with him through the night and into this morning. They captured something essential about their relationship with Wales that he wanted to share with the world. This wasn't just about royal duties or ceremonial obligations. This was about two young people who had found themselves in a place that welcomed them, challenged them, and ultimately changed them. The story of William and Catherine's connection to Wales began long before they were married, long before he inherited the title of Prince of Wales. It started during their university years, when they were still just students trying to figure out who they were and what they wanted from life. Even then, Wales held a special place in William's heart, but it wasn't until he brought Catherine there that he began to understand what the connection truly meant. Their first visit together had been unofficial, almost casual. William had wanted to show Catherine the places that mattered to him, the landscapes that had shaped his father's environmental passion and his own growing understanding of conservation. They had driven through small villages where Welsh was still the first language, stopped at local pubs where the conversation flowed as easily in one language as the other, and walked along coastlines that seemed to stretch forever into the Atlantic. Catherine had fallen in love with it immediately, not just with the beauty of the landscape, though that was undeniable, but with something deeper. There was an authenticity to Wales that felt different from other places they had visited together. People spoke their minds here. They were warm but not deferential, friendly but not false. They seemed to judge people by who they were rather than what titles they carried. "I feel like I can breathe here," Catherine had told him during that first visit, and William had known exactly what she meant. Wales had always been the place where he felt most like himself, least constrained by the weight of expectation and protocol that followed him everywhere else. Hearing Catherine express the same feeling had felt like coming home in a way he hadn't expected. As their relationship deepened, so did their connection to Wales. William began to understand that his love for this country wasn't just about the landscape or even the people, though both were extraordinary. It was about the values that seemed to permeate everything here. Hard work was respected. Community mattered. People looked out for each other. There was a directness and honesty to Welsh culture that appealed to both him and Catherine in ways they were only beginning to understand. The decision to make Wales their first official home together hadn't been made lightly. There were practical considerations, of course. William's military service meant they needed to be in a location that worked with his duties. But beyond the logistics, there was something that felt right about starting their married life here. Wales represented everything they hoped their partnership would be: grounded, authentic, connected to something larger than themselves. When they finally did move to Wales as newlyweds, the experience exceeded even their expectations. The community that embraced them was unlike anything either had experienced before. These weren't people who were impressed by titles or ceremony. They were people who valued contribution, who measured worth by what someone did rather than where they came from. It was exactly the kind of environment William and Catherine had hoped to find for this crucial period in their lives. Their daily routine in Wales was refreshingly normal. William would head off to his military duties while Catherine explored their new community. She joined local organizations, learned about Welsh history and culture, and began the process of understanding not just the language but the rhythms of life in their adopted home. Evenings were spent together, often just talking about their days, sharing stories of the people they'd met and the things they'd learned. The local community's response to their presence was everything they could have hoped for. There was curiosity, certainly, and a genuine warmth, but there was also a wonderful matter-of-factness about it all. The young couple down the road happened to be the future king and queen, but they were also neighbors who needed to figure out how to get their heating fixed and where to buy the best local produce. Catherine threw herself into learning about Welsh culture with the enthusiasm she brought to everything she cared about. She studied the language, not just to fulfill royal duties, but because she genuinely wanted to understand this place that was becoming so important to her. She learned about Welsh literature, music, and traditions. She spent time with local craftspeople, understanding not just what they made, but why it mattered to the community. William watched his wife embrace Wales with a joy that confirmed everything he had hoped about their decision to start their married life here. But more than that, he saw how Wales was changing both of them. The pressures that had always surrounded their relationship seemed less intense here. The expectations felt more manageable. They were building something real together, something that belonged to them rather than to the institution of monarchy. Their home in Wales became a sanctuary in ways neither had fully anticipated. It was where they learned to be married, not just engaged. It was where they discovered how to balance their private life with their public duties. It was where they began to understand what kind of partnership they wanted to build and what kind of contribution they wanted to make to the world. The house itself was important, but it was really about the life they built inside it. They learned to cook together, often attempting to master traditional Welsh dishes with varying degrees of success. They entertained friends and family, always making sure to include local people in their gatherings. They created traditions that were uniquely theirs, borrowing from Welsh customs but adapting them to their own needs and personalities. Catherine's transformation during their time in Wales was particularly striking. She had always been confident and capable, but Wales seemed to unlock something new in her. Perhaps it was the freedom from some of the more formal constraints of royal life, or perhaps it was simply the joy of being newlyweds in a place they both loved. But she blossomed in ways that delighted William and impressed everyone who met her. Their engagement with the local community went far beyond what was expected or required. They attended village events, supported local businesses, and genuinely invested themselves in the life of their adopted home. This wasn't about fulfilling royal duties. It was about being good neighbors and contributing members of a community they had chosen to join. The Welsh language became a particular passion for both of them. William had some familiarity from previous visits, but Catherine started from scratch with typical determination. They practiced together, often dissolving into laughter at their mistakes but persisting until they could hold basic conversations. The effort they put into learning the language was noticed and appreciated by their neighbors, who saw it as evidence of genuine respect for Welsh culture. As William stood in his Cardiff office, preparing for his summit speech, all of these memories felt immediate and vivid. Wales hadn't just been their first home, it had been their foundation. Everything they had built since, every challenge they had faced together, every triumph they had celebrated, could be traced back to those formative years when they were simply a young married couple trying to figure out life together in a place that had welcomed them completely. The summit delegates would hear about Wales' economic potential, its environmental leadership, and its cultural significance. But William wanted them to understand something more personal, that this was a place where people could become their best selves, where authentic relationships were valued over artificial ones, where the future was built on foundations of community and mutual respect. His phone buzzed with a message from Catherine, who was back in London with their children. "Remember to tell them about the bread," she had written, referring to their ongoing quest to master traditional Welsh bread recipes. It was exactly the kind of detail that made him smile and reminded him why this speech mattered so much to him. Wales had given them everything they needed to build a strong marriage and a meaningful life of service. Now, as Prince of Wales, William wanted to give something back to the country that had given them so much. The summit speech would be just the beginning of that effort, but it felt like an important beginning, a chance to share with the world what he and Catherine had discovered in the valleys and mountains of their first real home together. The conference room filled slowly as delegates from around the world took their seats for the opening session of the International Sustainable Development Summit. William could see them through the window of his preparation room. Ministers, business leaders, environmental activists, and academics, all gathered in Cardiff for 3 days of discussions about the future of sustainable development. The choice of Wales as the summit location hadn't been accidental. William had specifically requested that the event be held here, and now he had the opportunity to explain why. His private secretary knocked softly on the door. "Your Royal Highness, we're ready for you in 5 minutes." William nodded, taking one last look at his speech notes. He had written most of this address himself, drawing on memories and experiences that protocol speeches rarely contained. Today, he wouldn't just be representing the monarchy or even Britain. He would be speaking as someone whose life had been fundamentally shaped by Wales and its people. The walk to the main conference hall took him through corridors lined with photographs showcasing Wales' natural beauty and cultural heritage. Images of Snowdonia's peaks, the Pembrokeshire coastline, and the industrial heritage of the South Wales valleys reminded him of the incredible diversity packed into this small country. But as stunning as these landscapes were, William knew his speech needed to go deeper than tourism promotion. He wanted to share what Wales had taught him about community, sustainability, and authentic leadership. As he entered the conference hall, the audience rose. William acknowledged them with a nod and made his way to the podium. The room was impressive, with delegates representing nearly every continent. Translation booths lined the back wall, and cameras positioned around the room would carry his words to audiences worldwide. But despite the formal setting, William felt the same sense of groundedness that Wales had always given him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. "When my team and I were planning this summit, there was never any question about where it should be held. Wales isn't just the location for our discussions about sustainable development. It's a living example of how communities can thrive when they balance economic progress with environmental responsibility and social cohesion." The delegates settled into their seats, some taking notes, others leaning forward with interest. William had their attention, but he knew the real test would be whether he could make them understand why Wales mattered beyond its role as a summit venue. "I want to share with you why Wales holds such significance for me personally," William continued. "Not because of my title as Prince of Wales, though I am deeply honored by that responsibility, but because this country became my first real home with my wife, Catherine. It was here that we learned what it means to be part of a community, and it was here that we discovered principles of leadership that have guided everything we've done since." A slight murmur rippled through the audience. Royal speeches rarely included such personal revelations, and William could see that he had surprised some of the delegates. But this was exactly what he had intended. The lessons Wales had taught him weren't abstract policy concepts. They were lived experiences that had shaped two people who would someday play significant roles in British public life. "When Catherine and I first made our home in Wales," William said, his voice warming as he drew on these memories, "we were young, newly married, and honestly, we weren't entirely sure what we were doing. Like many young couples, we were learning how to build a life together. But we were fortunate to do that learning in a place that values authenticity over appearance, contribution over status, and community over individual achievement." The prince paused, allowing his words to settle. He could see some delegates nodding, perhaps recognizing similar values in their own cultures. Others looked curious about where this personal story was heading. William smiled slightly, remembering Catherine's advice to let his genuine affection for Wales come through rather than hiding it behind formal language. "Our neighbors didn't treat us as representatives of the monarchy," he continued. "They treated us as people who had chosen to make Wales our home, and they expected us to contribute to the community just like anyone else. That expectation was one of the greatest gifts we could have received. It taught us that true leadership isn't about the authority that comes with a title. It's about the trust you earn through your actions." William moved away from the podium slightly, a gesture that made his delivery feel more conversational despite the formal setting. Catherine threw herself into learning Welsh not because it was expected of her, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the culture she was joining. I watched her spend hours with local craftspeople, learning traditional techniques not for photo opportunities, but because she was fascinated by the skill and history behind their work. The image of Catherine bent over a loom, laughing with the local weaver who was patiently teaching her traditional patterns, was one of William's favorite memories from their early marriage. It perfectly captured her approach to new experiences, genuine curiosity respect for expertise, and determination to understand rather than just observe. Those experiences taught us something crucial about sustainable development, William said, bringing the personal story back to the summit's central theme. Real sustainability isn't just about environmental policies or economic frameworks, though those are certainly important. It's about creating communities where people feel connected to each other and to the place they call home. It's about preserving traditions while embracing innovation. It's about ensuring that progress benefits everyone, not just a privileged few. The delegates were listening intently now, many taking detailed notes. William could see that his personal approach was resonating. These weren't just policy prescriptions from a royal speech. They were insights drawn from lived experience, which gave them a different kind of authority. Wales showed us that environmental stewardship and economic prosperity don't have to be opposing forces, William continued. We saw communities that had successfully transitioned from heavy industry to sustainable agriculture and renewable energy, creating jobs while protecting the landscapes that define Welsh identity. We met farmers who were using traditional knowledge alongside cutting-edge technology to produce food in ways that enriched rather than depleted the soil. One of William's most vivid memories was of a visit to a farm in mid-Wales where the owner had shown them how ancient crop rotation techniques, combined with modern soil science, had actually increased both yield and biodiversity. The farmer had explained his methods with the pride of someone who knew he was contributing to something larger than his own success. Catherine and I learned that sustainability is ultimately about relationships, William said, his voice taking on the conviction that came from deep personal belief. The relationship between people and the land they depend on, the relationship between economic activity and environmental health, the relationship between current prosperity and future opportunity. Wales taught us that these relationships can be mutually reinforcing when they're based on respect and long-term thinking. The prince gestured toward the windows of the conference hall, beyond which the Welsh landscape stretched toward distant mountains. The country that surrounds us today is living proof of these principles. Wales has some of Europe's most ambitious environmental targets, but it's pursuing them in ways that create opportunities rather than impose burdens. The renewable energy sector here employs thousands of people. Sustainable agriculture is providing both environmental benefits and economic stability for rural communities. William's passion for these topics was evident in his delivery, but it was passion grounded in specific knowledge rather than general enthusiasm. He had spent years learning about Welsh environmental initiatives, not just for speeches like this one, but because they represented approaches he wanted to promote more widely. What makes the Welsh model particularly valuable, he continued, is that it's based on community engagement rather than top-down mandates. The most successful sustainability projects here are the ones that emerged from local initiative and local ownership. People protect and improve what they feel belongs to them. They innovate when they see direct benefits from that innovation. This observation drew on countless conversations William and Catherine had had with local leaders during their years in Wales. They had seen repeatedly that the most effective environmental projects were the ones that grew out of community needs and were led by people who would live with the consequences of their decisions. Catherine and I experienced this firsthand when we joined a local tree planting initiative in our community, William shared. We weren't there as royal patrons offering ceremonial support. We were there as neighbors who wanted to contribute to a project that would benefit everyone. We planted trees, learned about native species, and shared conversations with families who had been working on similar projects for generations. The memory of that day was particularly clear in William's mind. He and Catherine had arrived expecting to plant a few trees for the cameras, but they had ended up staying for hours, drawn into discussions about soil conditions, wildlife habitat, and the long-term vision for the local ecosystem. By the end of the day, they felt like genuine participants rather than honored guests. That experience taught us something that I believe is crucial for this summit, William said, his tone becoming more urgent. Sustainable development succeeds when it's driven by authentic community engagement. People don't just need to be consulted about changes that affect their lives. They need to be genuine partners in creating those changes. The delegates were clearly engaged now, many leaning forward and taking notes. William could sense that his approach was working. By grounding policy discussions in personal experience, he was making abstract concepts feel immediate and actionable. Wales also taught us about the importance of preserving cultural identity while embracing change, William continued. The Welsh language isn't just a historical curiosity here. It's a living part of daily life that coexists naturally with global connectivity. Traditional music and literature thrive alongside cutting-edge technology companies. Ancient festivals bring communities together to celebrate both their heritage and their contemporary achievements. This cultural vitality was something that had impressed both William and Catherine from their earliest visits to Wales. They had seen how communities could maintain their distinctive character while participating fully in the modern world. It was a balance that many places struggled to achieve, but Wales seemed to manage it with remarkable success. Catherine often says that Wales taught her the difference between preservation and stagnation, William shared. Preserving what's valuable from the past doesn't mean refusing to change. It means understanding what makes a community strong and finding ways to maintain that strength even as circumstances evolve. The prince paused, looking out at the diverse audience before him. Representatives from every continent were present, each bringing their own perspectives on development challenges and opportunities. But William believed the lessons Wales had taught him were universal, even if their specific applications would vary from place to place. As we begin our discussions today, William concluded this section of his speech, I want to suggest that the most important question isn't what Wales can teach the world, but what communities everywhere can teach each other. Every place represented in this room has its own examples of sustainable development, its own innovations, its own wisdom about balancing progress with preservation. Our task is to learn from each other and adapt good ideas to local circumstances. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, suggesting that William's personal approach had resonated with his audience. But as he prepared to move into the more technical portions of his address, he felt confident that he had accomplished his main goal. He had shared why Wales mattered to him personally, and in doing so, he had made the case for why the Welsh approach to sustainable development deserved serious international attention. The summit delegates had been deeply engaged during the morning sessions, and William could sense a genuine enthusiasm for the discussions that would follow his opening address. During the lunch break, he found himself surrounded by ministers and business leaders eager to learn more about the Welsh initiatives he had referenced. But what struck him most was how many of them shared similar stories from their own countries, describing communities that had found innovative ways to balance economic development with environmental protection and social cohesion. Your Royal Highness, said the Environment Minister from New Zealand, your description of community-led conservation reminds me strongly of our indigenous-led environmental programs. There's something universal about the principle that people protect what they feel ownership of. William nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what Catherine and I discovered. The most successful projects we encountered in Wales were the ones where local people had real decision-making power, not just consultation opportunities. These informal conversations were exactly what William had hoped the summit would generate. By sharing his personal experience with Wales, he wasn't suggesting that other countries should simply copy Welsh approaches. Instead, he was encouraging a discussion about principles that could be adapted to different cultural and geographic contexts. As the afternoon session began, William took his seat among the delegates rather than returning to the podium. He wanted to participate in the discussions as much as lead them, and his experiences in Wales had taught him that the best insights often came from listening rather than speaking. The first panel focused on renewable energy development, and William listened with interest as speakers from Denmark, Costa Rica, and Kenya shared their countries' approaches. Each had faced different challenges and found different solutions, but there were common themes that reminded him of what he had observed in Wales. The Danish representative spoke about the importance of public ownership in wind energy projects. When communities own the turbines that serve them, she explained, they see renewable energy as an asset rather than an imposition. The profits stay local, and people become advocates rather than opponents of further development. William thought immediately of a wind farm he and Catherine had visited in North Wales, where the local community had insisted on owning a share of the project. The farmer who had showed them around had been proudly explaining how the revenue from the turbines on his land was helping fund the local school and community center. The Costa Rican delegate described how his country's reforestation programs had been most successful when they provided immediate economic benefits to participating families. People need to eat today, he said simply. Conservation programs that ignore that reality are doomed to fail. This observation resonated deeply with William's experiences in Wales. He had seen how the most effective environmental projects were the ones that improved people's lives in the short term while creating long-term sustainability. The tree planting project he had mentioned in his speech was successful partly because it created jobs for local people while improving the local ecosystem. When the discussion turned to agriculture, William found himself thinking about the farmers he and Catherine had met during their years in Wales. These weren't hobby farmers or gentleman agriculturalists. They were hard-working people trying to make a living from the land while dealing with climate change, market pressures, and regulatory requirements. One conversation in particular had stayed with him. They had visited a sheep farm in the Brecon Beacons, where the farmer was experimenting with traditional grazing patterns that his grandfather had used. By rotating his sheep through different pastures according to an old schedule, he had discovered that he could improve soil health, increase biodiversity, and actually improve the productivity of his land. My grandfather couldn't read or write, the farmer had told them, but he understood this land better than any agricultural scientist I've met. The trick isn't choosing between traditional knowledge and modern science. It's finding ways to combine them. That conversation had crystallized something important for William about sustainable development. The most effective approaches often involved rediscovering traditional wisdom and combining it with contemporary knowledge, rather than assuming that newer was automatically better. During a break in the panel discussions, William was approached by a group of young climate activists who had been invited to participate in the summit. Their energy and passion reminded him of Catherine's enthusiasm when they had first started learning about Welsh environmental initiatives. "Sir," said a young woman from Bangladesh, "when you talked about Wales being your first home, it made me think about how climate change is forcing people in my country to leave their homes. How do we create the kind of community connection you described when people can't stay in one place?" It was a profound question that highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of climate change. William had been fortunate to choose Wales as his home. Millions of people around the world were being forced to leave their homes because of environmental changes beyond their control. "That's one of the most important questions we face," William replied. "Catherine and I learned in Wales that community isn't just about geography. It's about relationships, shared values, and mutual support. Those things can be recreated in new places, but it requires intentional effort and genuine welcome from receiving communities." He thought about the refugee families that he and Catherine had met during their time in Wales, people who had been forced to leave everything behind, but had found ways to contribute to their new communities while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. Their resilience had been inspiring, but it had also highlighted how much support people need when they're forced to start over. The afternoon's discussions continued with panels on sustainable finance, circular economy principles, and social equity in environmental policy. William contributed to several discussions, often drawing on specific examples from Wales to illustrate broader principles. But he was equally interested in learning from the other delegates, many of whom described innovative approaches that he thought could be adapted for use in Wales or elsewhere in Britain. The representative from Bhutan described his country's Gross National Happiness Index, which measured prosperity in terms of environmental conservation, cultural preservation, good governance, and sustainable development rather than just economic growth. "We realized that GDP tells you how fast money is changing hands," he explained, "but it doesn't tell you whether people are actually better off." This philosophy resonated strongly with what William had observed in Welsh communities. The places where he and Catherine had felt most at home weren't necessarily the wealthiest in purely economic terms, but they were rich in social connections, cultural vitality, and environmental quality. People seemed genuinely happy there, and that happiness appeared to be sustainable because it wasn't based on consumption or competition, but on contribution and community. As the day progressed, William found himself increasingly energized by the discussions. The summit was achieving exactly what he had hoped, bringing together diverse perspectives and experiences to identify principles that could guide sustainable development efforts worldwide. The personal approach he had taken in his opening speech seemed to have encouraged other delegates to share their own stories and insights rather than just reciting official positions. During the final panel of the day, which focused on youth engagement in sustainability initiatives, William was reminded of the young people he and Catherine had worked with in Wales. They had been consistently impressed by the creativity and commitment of Welsh young people, who often saw environmental challenges as opportunities for innovation rather than just problems to solve. He thought of the group of teenagers in Swansea who had started a project to turn food waste into biogas for their school. When he and Catherine had visited the project, the students had explained their work with an enthusiasm that was infectious. They weren't just learning about renewable energy in theory. They were generating actual power that heated their classrooms and cafeteria. The most important thing adults can do for young people, William offered during the panel discussion, is to give them real responsibility and genuine authority to make changes. Young people don't just want to be consulted about their future. They want to be actively involved in creating it. This observation drew nods from several delegates, including some who had initially seemed skeptical about including youth voices in the summit. William suspected that his personal experiences with young people in Wales had given his words more credibility than abstract arguments about youth engagement might have carried. As the afternoon session concluded, William reflected on how different this summit felt from many international conferences he had attended. The decision to ground the discussions in specific places and personal experiences seemed to have created a more honest and productive atmosphere than the usual diplomatic abstractions. The Welsh government's first minister approached him as delegates began filing out of the conference hall. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to thank you for the way you spoke about Wales today. You captured something about our country that's often difficult to express in policy documents or economic statistics." William smiled, thinking about Catherine's reaction when he shared this conversation with her later. "Wales gave Catherine and me something invaluable during the early years of our marriage," he replied. "If today's discussions help other places discover similar approaches to community building and sustainable development, then we'll have given something back to Wales and to the principles it taught us." The First Minister nodded. "I think today has been a good start on that effort. The delegates seem genuinely interested in learning from each other rather than just promoting their own programs." As William made his way back to his preparation room to review notes for the evening's reception, he felt optimistic about the remaining days of the summit. The foundation had been laid for meaningful discussions about sustainable development, and the personal approach he had taken seemed to have encouraged other delegates to share their own experiences and insights. His phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "How did it go?" she had written. "Did you remember to tell them about the bread?" William smiled, remembering the countless evenings he and Catherine had spent in their Welsh kitchen, attempting to master traditional Welsh bread recipes with varying degrees of success. It was exactly the kind of detail that illustrated why their time in Wales had been so meaningful. They hadn't just lived there. They had tried to become part of the community, learning its traditions and contributing to its life in whatever ways they could. Tonight's reception would provide opportunities for more informal conversations with the delegates. William was particularly looking forward to hearing more stories from representatives of indigenous communities, whose approaches to sustainable development often embodied principles that he and Catherine had discovered in Wales. The evening would also include performances by Welsh musicians and displays of local food and crafts, giving delegates a chance to experience Welsh culture directly rather than just hearing about it in speeches. As he prepared for the reception, William felt grateful for the opportunity to share his love for Wales with such a diverse and engaged international audience. The summit was only in its first day, but already he could see that meaningful connections were being formed and important ideas were being exchanged. Wales was proving once again to be a place where people could come together, share their experiences, and work toward common goals. The evening reception took place in the historic halls of Cardiff Castle, with its medieval walls providing a dramatic backdrop for conversations about the future of sustainable development. William moved through the gathering, genuinely enjoying the opportunity to continue discussions that had begun during the formal sessions. The informal setting seemed to encourage even more personal sharing, and he found himself learning as much from these conversations as he hoped others were learning from his experiences with Wales. Near the castle's ancient fireplace, he encountered the delegate from Rwanda, who had listened intently to William's morning speech about community-led development. "Your Royal Highness," she said, Your description of how you and your wife became part of the Welsh community reminded me of our approach to post-genocide reconciliation. We learned that healing happens when people work together on shared goals rather than just talking about their differences. The conversation that followed was one of the most moving of William's day. The Rwandan delegate described how her country had rebuilt itself by focusing on practical cooperation between communities that had been torn apart by violence. Environmental restoration projects had played a crucial role in this healing process, bringing people together to plant trees, restore watersheds, and rebuild agricultural systems that benefited everyone. We discovered that when people work together to improve their shared environment, she explained, they begin to see each other as partners rather than opponents. The land becomes a bridge between communities. William was struck by how closely this paralleled his observations about Wales. Some of the strongest community bonds he had witnessed there had been forged through collaborative work on environmental projects. Whether it was restoring traditional hedgerows, managing river systems, or developing renewable energy cooperatives, these initiatives had brought together people who might not otherwise have interacted, creating relationships that strengthened the entire community. As the evening progressed, William found himself in conversation with a group of delegates from Pacific Island nations, whose perspectives on climate change carried particular urgency. Their countries faced existential threats from rising sea levels, but they had also developed innovative approaches to adaptation that other coastal regions were beginning to study. In Tuvalu, explained one delegate, we've learned that adaptation isn't just about building seawalls or relocating people. It's about maintaining cultural identity and community connections even when the physical environment is changing. Our traditional knowledge about ocean patterns and weather cycles is helping us develop early warning systems that no outside technology could provide. This conversation reminded William of his discussions with Welsh coastal communities that were dealing with their own challenges from climate change. The fishing villages along the Welsh coast had centuries of accumulated knowledge about local weather patterns and ocean conditions. When this traditional expertise was combined with modern climate science, it created adaptation strategies that were both practical and culturally appropriate. William shared the story of a coastal village in Pembrokeshire where local fishermen had worked with marine scientists to develop new approaches to sustainable fishing. The fishermen's detailed knowledge of local fish populations and breeding cycles had provided insights that transformed the scientists' understanding of how climate change was affecting the local ecosystem. The partnership worked because both sides brought essential knowledge to the table, William explained. The scientists had tools for analyzing long-term trends, but the fishermen had intimate knowledge of year-to-year variations that the data couldn't capture. Together, they developed fishing practices that actually improved the health of fish populations while maintaining the economic viability of the fishing community. The Pacific Island delegates nodded enthusiastically. They had encountered similar dynamics in their own communities, where traditional ecological knowledge provided insights that complemented but couldn't be replaced by modern scientific methods. As the reception continued, William was approached by several delegates who wanted to share their own stories of places that had shaped their understanding of sustainable development. The Minister of Environment from Costa Rica described how his country's decision to prioritize conservation had initially been driven by economic necessity, but had evolved into a fundamental national value. We couldn't compete with other countries in heavy industry or large-scale agriculture, he explained, so we decided to compete on environmental quality instead. What started as economic strategy became our cultural identity. Now conservation is part of what it means to be Costa Rican. This transformation resonated with William's observations about Wales. The country's shift from heavy industry to sustainable development hadn't been easy, but it had ultimately strengthened Welsh identity rather than weakening it. Communities that had once been defined by coal mining or steel production had discovered new sources of pride in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and environmental leadership. William thought about the valleys in South Wales, where former mining communities had become centers for renewable energy development. The transition had been challenging, requiring new skills and different kinds of jobs. But the communities that had managed the transition successfully had maintained their strong collective identity while adapting to new economic realities. Catherine and I met many people during our time in Wales who had lived through that transition, William shared with the Costa Rican minister. What impressed us was their ability to honor their industrial heritage while embracing environmental leadership. They didn't see these as contradictory. They saw them as different expressions of the same community values: hard work, innovation, and looking out for each other. Near the end of the reception, William found himself in conversation with a group of young entrepreneurs who had been invited to the summit because of their work on sustainable technology startups. Their energy reminded him of the young people he and Catherine had encountered throughout Wales, who often had fresh perspectives on old challenges. One young woman from Kenya described her company's work developing solar-powered water purification systems for rural communities. "The technology is important," she explained, "but the social innovation is just as crucial. We learned that sustainable solutions have to be locally owned and locally maintained, or they fail as soon as the outside support disappears." This insight perfectly captured what William had observed about successful development projects in Wales. The initiatives that thrived over time were the ones that became genuinely integrated into community life, not just imposed from outside. Whether it was renewable energy cooperatives, sustainable farming practices, or cultural preservation projects, success depended on local ownership and local leadership. William shared the story of a wind energy cooperative in North Wales that had been struggling until the local community took control of the project. Once local people were making the decisions about how the wind farm operated and how the profits were used, he explained, the project became a source of community pride rather than a source of conflict. The same turbines that had been controversial when they were owned by an outside company became symbols of local innovation when they were owned by the community. The young entrepreneurs were fascinated by this story, several of them taking notes about how they might adapt similar approaches in their own work. William was struck by how universal these principles seemed to be. Whether the context was rural Kenya, industrial Wales, or anywhere else, sustainable development succeeded when it was driven by local leadership and addressed local priorities. As the reception wound down, William reflected on the richness of the conversations he had participated in throughout the day. The decision to frame the summit around personal experiences and specific places had clearly encouraged delegates to share their own stories and insights, rather than simply reciting official positions. The result had been discussions that were both more honest and more practical than typical international conferences. The Welsh First Minister approached him as guests began departing. "Your Royal Highness, I've been listening to conversations throughout the evening, and I think your decision to speak personally about Wales this morning set exactly the right tone for the summit. People are sharing real experiences rather than just diplomatic talking points." William nodded, feeling pleased with how the day had developed. "Wales taught Catherine and me that authentic relationships produce better results than formal ones," he replied. "I hope that sharing our genuine experiences here might encourage others to do the same." "Well, it's certainly working," the First Minister observed. "I've heard more practical ideas exchanged today than in most international conferences I've attended. There's something about grounding policy discussions in specific places and personal experiences that makes them more productive." As William prepared to leave Cardiff Castle, his phone buzzed with several messages from Catherine. She had been following news coverage of the summit and wanted to hear his impressions of the day's discussions. One message particularly caught his attention. "The news coverage has been wonderful, but I want to hear about the conversations that didn't make it into the headlines." That request captured exactly what had made the day so meaningful for William. The formal speeches and official sessions were important, but the real value of the summit lay in the personal connections and informal exchanges that were happening between the scheduled events. These were the conversations that would influence how delegates approached sustainable development when they returned to their own countries. William's driver was waiting outside the castle, but he took a moment to look back at the illuminated medieval walls where so much meaningful conversation had taken place. Tomorrow would bring more formal sessions, site visits to Welsh sustainability projects, and working groups focused on specific policy challenges. But tonight had established something valuable: a spirit of genuine collaboration based on shared commitment to community-led development and environmental stewardship. As his car made its way through the quiet streets of Cardiff, William found himself thinking about the conversations he would share with Catherine when they spoke later that evening. She would be particularly interested in the stories from the Pacific Island delegates and the young entrepreneurs. both groups whose perspectives had enriched his own understanding of how sustainable development could work in different contexts. But more than anything, he wanted to tell her how gratifying it had been to share their experiences in Wales with such a receptive international audience. The personal approach he had taken in his morning speech had been somewhat risky. Royal addresses rarely included such intimate details about private life. But the positive response from delegates throughout the day had confirmed that authenticity was more powerful than protocol in creating meaningful connections. Wales had given him and Catherine a foundation for their life together, and now it was providing a foundation for international cooperation on sustainable development. The same principles that had guided successful community projects throughout Wales, relationships built on trust, local ownership of solutions, and integration of traditional wisdom with contemporary knowledge, were proving relevant to development challenges worldwide. Tomorrow's sessions would delve deeper into specific policy mechanisms and implementation strategies. But tonight's conversations had established something equally important: a shared understanding that sustainable development wasn't just about technical solutions, but about building communities where people felt connected to each other and to the places they called home. Wales had taught William and Catherine this lesson, and now they were helping to share it with the world. The final day of the summit dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming across the Welsh countryside. William stood at his hotel window, looking out at the landscape that had become so meaningful to him and Catherine during their early married years. Today's sessions would focus on creating actionable commitments from the past 3 days of discussions, but he felt confident that the foundation laid through personal storytelling and authentic dialogue would translate into meaningful results. The morning's field visits had taken delegates to see Welsh sustainability projects firsthand. William had joined the group visiting a renewable energy cooperative in the Rhondda Valley, where former coal miners were now installing solar panels and wind turbines. The transformation of this valley, once synonymous with coal extraction, into a center for renewable energy development perfectly illustrated the themes that had run through the entire summit. Standing in what had once been a coal processing facility, now converted into a training center for renewable energy technicians, William listened as the center's director explained how the transition had been managed. "We didn't want to just replace coal with something else," the director said. "We wanted to build on the skills and work ethic that had always defined this community. The same attention to safety, the same commitment to quality work, the same solidarity between workers, it all transferred to renewable energy." The delegates asked detailed questions about financing, training programs, and community engagement. But William could see that they were equally impressed by something less tangible: the pride and optimism that characterized the people they met. This wasn't just economic development. It was cultural renewal based on continuity rather than rupture with the past. One delegate from Germany, whose own country had undergone significant energy transitions, observed how different the Welsh approach seemed from other post-industrial transformations he had witnessed. "Usually when traditional industries disappear, communities lose their identity along with their jobs," he noted. "Here, it feels like the community has maintained its identity while completely changing its economic base. How did that happen?" The center director smiled. "I think it's because we never forgot that our real strength was our people, not our industry. Coal was what we did, but it wasn't who we were. When we had to find new work, we focused on what kind of work would let us remain the kind of people we wanted to be." This conversation crystallized something important for William about the Welsh approach to sustainable development. The most successful transitions had been the ones that preserved community values and social relationships while changing economic activities. People had been willing to learn new skills and adapt to new circumstances, but they had insisted on doing so in ways that maintained the solidarity and mutual support that defined their communities. As the field visit concluded and delegates returned to Cardiff for the summit's final sessions, William reflected on how this principle might apply in other contexts. The delegates had shared stories from their own countries about communities facing similar transitions, and many had expressed interest in learning more about how Welsh communities had managed to maintain their social cohesion through economic transformation. The afternoon's closing session brought together all the themes that had emerged during the 3 days of discussions. William delivered brief remarks that attempted to synthesize what they had learned, but he was careful to present it as a beginning rather than a conclusion. "When I spoke on Monday about Wales being my first home with Catherine," he began, I wanted to share what this place had taught us about the relationship between community, sustainability, and authentic leadership. Over the past 3 days, I've learned that similar lessons are being discovered in communities around the world. The delegates had indeed shared remarkable stories. From indigenous-led conservation projects in the Amazon to urban farming initiatives in Detroit, from renewable energy cooperatives in Denmark to sustainable fishing practices in New Zealand, the summit had showcased approaches that shared common principles while respecting local circumstances. What strikes me about all these examples, William continued, is that they're based on trust. Trust between community members, trust between traditional knowledge and modern science, trust between economic development and environmental protection. Catherine and I discovered that same foundation of trust during our time in Wales, and I believe it's the essential ingredient for sustainable development anywhere. The speech was shorter than his opening address, focusing on the commitments that delegates had made during their working group sessions. But William was more interested in the informal conversations that continued as delegates prepared to return to their home countries. These relationships, built through shared storytelling and genuine dialogue, would likely prove more valuable than any formal agreements. As the summit officially concluded, William found himself surrounded by delegates who wanted to share final thoughts and exchange contact information. Many expressed gratitude not just for the substantive discussions, but for the approach that had made those discussions possible. "Sir," said the young climate activist from Bangladesh who had questioned him on the first day, "when you talked about Wales being your first home, it made me think differently about what home means. It's not just where you come from, it's where you choose to invest yourself." William was moved by this observation, which captured something essential about his and Catherine's relationship with Wales. They hadn't been assigned to Wales or required to live there. They had chosen it as the place to begin their married life together, and that choice had shaped everything that followed. The Rwandan delegate approached him with a small wrapped gift. "This is coffee from the cooperative that grew out of one of our reconciliation projects," she explained. "I wanted you and your wife to have something from our community, just as you shared your community with us." These personal gestures were touching evidence of the connections that had been formed during the summit. William knew that many of the delegates would maintain contact with each other, continuing conversations and potentially collaborating on joint projects. The summit had succeeded in creating a network of practitioners and policymakers who shared similar approaches to sustainable development. As delegates began departing for the airport, William received a call from Catherine. She had been following news coverage of the summit and was eager to hear his assessment of the 3 days. "It exceeded my expectations," he told her honestly. "The decision to ground everything in personal experience and specific places really worked. People shared insights and stories that you never hear in formal diplomatic settings." Catherine's response was characteristically perceptive. "That's exactly what Wales taught us, isn't it? That authentic relationships produce better results than formal ones. It sounds like the summit proved that principle works even in international diplomacy." William agreed completely. The summit's success hadn't been measured just in formal commitments or policy agreements, though there had been plenty of both. The real achievement had been the creation of genuine relationships between people who were working on similar challenges in different parts of the world. "I keep thinking about something the delegate from Costa Rica said," William continued. He observed that every successful sustainability project he'd encountered had been based on love. Love for a place, love for a community, love for future generations. That's exactly what we discovered in Wales. The strongest environmental projects here weren't driven by abstract principles, but by people's genuine affection for specific places and communities. As his conversation with Catherine continued, William found himself reflecting on how much his understanding of leadership had been shaped by their experiences in Wales. The most effective leaders he had encountered there hadn't been the ones with the most formal authority. They had been the ones who had earned trust through their contributions to community life. "I think that's what made the summit work," he told Catherine. "Instead of speaking from authority, I tried to speak from experience, and that seemed to encourage other people to share their own experiences rather than just reciting their official positions." Catherine's enthusiasm for this observation was evident in her voice. "That's exactly what we learned during our time there. People responded to us differently when we approached them as neighbors rather than as representatives of the monarchy." Authenticity created better relationships than protocol ever could. The evening's farewell reception was smaller and more intimate than the opening night's gathering at Cardiff Castle. Held in a local restaurant that specialized in traditional Welsh cuisine prepared with contemporary techniques, it perfectly embodied the theme of honoring tradition while embracing innovation that had run through the entire summit. William moved between tables, continuing conversations that had begun during the formal sessions, and savoring what he knew would be the final opportunities for face-to-face discussion with many of the delegates. The informal setting encouraged even more personal sharing, and several delegates took the opportunity to express how much the summit had meant to them personally. "Your Royal Highness," said the Environment Minister from New Zealand, "I've attended dozens of international conferences, but this is the first one where I felt like I was learning from colleagues rather than just listening to presentations. The personal approach you took really changed the dynamic." This feedback was particularly gratifying for William, who had been somewhat concerned about whether his departure from standard diplomatic protocol would be well received. The positive response from delegates throughout the summit had confirmed that authenticity was indeed more powerful than formality in creating meaningful dialogue. As the evening concluded, William was approached by the Welsh First Minister, who had been observing the summit's proceedings with evident satisfaction. "Your Royal Highness, I think this summit will be remembered as a turning point in how we approach international cooperation on sustainable development. You've shown that sharing personal experiences can be more effective than sharing policy papers." William appreciated the observation, but he was careful to credit the broader community that had made the summit possible. "Wales provided the perfect setting for this kind of dialogue," he replied. "The combination of environmental innovation, cultural authenticity, and community solidarity that we showcased here reflects years of work by thousands of people across the country." As the last delegates departed and the summit officially concluded, William took a moment to walk alone through the quiet streets of Cardiff. The city had provided a perfect backdrop for 3 days of intensive discussion about sustainable development, but more importantly, it had demonstrated the principles that made such development possible. His phone buzzed with a final message from Catherine. "I can't wait to hear all the stories you haven't had time to share yet, and I'm proud of you for finding a way to share what Wales means to us with people who can use those insights to make a difference in their own communities." That message captured exactly what William hoped the summit had achieved. Wales had given him and Catherine invaluable lessons about community, leadership, and authentic relationship building. By sharing those lessons through personal storytelling rather than abstract policy discussion, they had hopefully provided insights that delegates could adapt to their own circumstances and challenges. The summit's formal outcomes would be important: new partnerships between countries, increased funding for community-led development projects, and policy commitments that reflected the principles discussed over the 3 days. But William suspected that the summit's most significant impact would come from the relationships that had been formed and the approaches to leadership that had been modeled. As he prepared to return to London the following morning, William felt grateful for the opportunity to share his love for Wales with such a receptive international audience. The summit had been a success by any measure, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that the lessons Wales had taught him and Catherine were indeed universal. Communities everywhere could benefit from approaches based on trust, authenticity, and genuine respect for local knowledge and local leadership. Wales would always be their first home together, the place where they had learned to balance their private life with their public duties. But now it had also become a model for sustainable development that could inspire similar efforts around the world. The summit had shown that sharing personal experiences could indeed change how people thought about policy challenges, creating possibilities for collaboration that formal diplomacy alone could never achieve.